We're going to begin with a couple of stories from investors, from religious congregations who have made the decision to divest, and they're going to tell you a little bit about their story. We're going to hear from Teague, who is a member of the Faith and Justice team of the Columban Missionary Society in Britain and edits their newsletter, Vocation for Justice. I'm sure that many of you know Ellen. Ellen is also a freelance Catholic journalist who writes and campaigns on justice, peace and ecology issues. She writes regularly for the Tablet and for Redemptorist publications, collaborating closely with many organisations, some of which I'm privileged to belong to, including the Justice and Peace Network.
So the Columban missionaries, I'm really here because we have a big plenary meeting this week, so I'm not the expert, just in case, unfortunately, there isn't a question time. So, just go back to the first slide again. The Columbans have been very involved in the extractive industries, lobbying them to change. We've gone to company AGMs. I've been to Rio Tinto's one twice. So advocacy on the radical sort of actions is what we've been particularly interested in. This is a clip from the Philippines, Father John Leyden with a group in his parish in Malate. So calling for divestment went alongside calling for no new coal-fired power stations to be opened in the Philippines. So the Columban structures, we have 3 countries where we have the majority of our investments and investment committees: Australia, Hong Kong and the USA. And our structure is we have a General Council in Hong Kong, we have a Bursars General's Office in Hong Kong, and an international JPIC, Justice, Peace, Integrity of Creation Office in Washington. So these slides are actually from our JPIC International Coordinator, Amy, who is really the lead person for the Columbans on this issue. So, action steps we've taken. Well, the Columbans were really in at the founding. John Leyden and Sean McDonough very involved in the founding of the global Catholic climate movement. And before then, in 2012, the General Assembly of the Columbans called on socially responsible investments, commitments to be sort of finalised. And the consultation process began in 2013. And our actual policy is over there if anybody wants a copy, or I can email it to you. It was finalised in 2015. So it included divestment. And I mean, you're aware this is actually a very new issue. 5 years ago, I mean, people would say, is that the same as disinvestment? Or what's that all about? You know, why are religious getting involved in that only sort of 5 years ago? So I believe that the Columbans were in the first statement of the global Catholic climate movement to disinvest. But it went alongside advocacy work, education work, formation, which is much more my area. So in 2016, we made that public announcement, and I think several other religious orders did, and made it via the Global Catholic Climate Movement, which is a movement which we think is fantastic. And the first meeting, I think, of members of that movement was in Paris. And I know people here saying they were there. Were you at that meeting? I didn't know you then, you see. And it was fantastic to think, gosh, you know, there were Franciscans from the rainforest in Brazil, and, you know, people from all over the world, the head of Caritas Africa, I think, from Ghana. So we were very, very proud to be involved in this. And of course, 2015 was the fantastic year that Laudato Si came out, and I think it's the official year the Global Catholic Climate Movement founded. So our papers on this were done in liaison with the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility in the US, with other religious congregations, and with the Columban current investment managers. So very briefly, Australia, big investment committee there, has 30% of Columban funds. So I think you can just read that there for yourself. One of the points, the application of the carbon underground list, the list of the top offending companies in terms of fossil fuels. You can get it off the internet. And, some of the, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, ExxonMobil are in the top 10 Further down, BHB Billiton, that's a company that we've stood outside their AGMs and looked into what they were doing in Colombia and highlighted the communities they were displacing in Colombia with their 4-mile wide hole. So these are all things that they looked at in Australia. Hong Kong, smaller funds there, but again, review of company holdings, seeking positive impact investing, so not just disinvesting from what we didn't like, but putting money towards what we did like, particularly renewables. And the Columbans have a policy against the nuclear option, so we don't put any money in that direction. Of course, they don't really need it because they get an awful lot of government money. And creating an evaluation process, this is terribly important. The few funds we do have in Britain are reviewed annually, every November. The head of the Columbans in this come to their committee and they overview. So constant evaluating is terribly important, and reviewing governance and structures to check that people know what they're doing in this field. It's terribly important when you're dealing with finance managers and so on, that you know what you're talking about. In the United States, Amy would say she's had the most difficult area of work in the United States, but reviewing exposure to fossil fuels, only about 5% of our investments, but 5% is 5% too many. So there's a lot of dialogue with the current manager and dialogue with other religious groups and the ICCR about that. So the challenges we've had, the urgency of the climate change crisis, a 12 years window, it's desperately urgent, and we know that from, the Columbans in Fiji, where, the soil's becoming very salinated, so the people we work with, and, the frequency of typhoons destroying, sweeping over the islands, there's a terrible urgency, but it's a slow process. You can speed it up, you can try to speed it up, and you need to put more resources towards it to speed it up. But it don't happen very quickly, so certainly get started now. Secondly, a big challenge of dialogue between ordained members, lay professional staff, lay consultants, and between the men and women. In the Columbans, we have lay missionaries. I'm a co-worker with the Columbans. There are women in there now, but women sometimes see things, well, they always do see things differently, and I think the urgency of climate change, I'm afraid, I think has been more there with women than with men, certainly at the start. So responding to that, education and collaboration, it's a real challenge. And one thing I would say is that people like me, who are under the JPIC heading, we've had to learn more about finance and investments, and I'm afraid I don't have a head for it. I turn off within 5 minutes on these things normally, but I've had to get more involved, because the fact is a lot of finance people, they don't know a lot about climate change and extractives. They're getting there, and the insurance industry is certainly, well aware of stranded assets and all that. It's getting there, but the real impact of some of these companies on the ground is not really there. And I can tell you from being at Rio Tinto AGMs, the very first thing they do, they welcome everybody, they put up slides of all their latest projects, and it's like a series of big holes in the ground. And everybody is clapping. Except for those of us who've been planted around the room saying, oh my God, why are they clapping? It's a completely different perspective. Another challenge is spreading the word, and I compliment Operation Noah and James for today. This is part of spreading the word. And I might say, sharing with other congregations and indeed the Vatican would be part of our role. The last September I was at the Vatican on a journalism course, and we had a talk from the Patrimony of the Holy See. And a part of the talk about Vatican finances was a huge section on SRI, socially responsible investment, or I think they called it ethical investment. We've got different terms for it. And there, the headings that he was running through, I thought, oh, that's very similar to our headings. But apparently the religious congregations were invited to submit their policies, and then the Vatican really built its policy around those. So, for example, he could say categorically the Vatican does not invest in fossil fuels. So I think we had a bit of an influence there. So, you know, it's very hard work for Amy and disseminating it through the Columbans, but, you know, we feel, you know, this sort of radical work of divesting is terribly important to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.